All right, so I'm finally sitting down to talk about the new iPhones that Apple introduced at their event. This took a lot longer than I anticipated because despite what other YouTubers will have you say, which is that the new iPhone 14 is basically a 13 and there's nothing new, there's a lot of stuff to talk about. So we're going to dive in and talk about the things that Apple introduced that's going to be available across the board with the new iPhones, both models, and then we're going to focus on the 14 standard and the 14 Pro. So let's get started with the features that will be available to both models. Then we'll dive into each. So for starters, the features that Apple's introduced that are going to be available on both iPhones include car crash detection, which is kind of interesting. This was something they actually introduced with the Apple Watch as well, but in the case that you don't have an Apple Watch and you just use an iPhone, you have it available as well. Kind of interesting that Apple has spent this much time crash testing cars for just a couple of device features. Maybe the car thing about Apple making one isn't so far-fetched. I don't know. Maybe that's just my conspiracy theory hat coming on. Sorry. Something else they introduced that's kind of interesting is the satellite SOS mode. Now, this one's interesting because essentially when you're out in the middle of nowhere and you don't have any signal, you actually get a little piece of software that allows you to know where to point your phone to connect it to a satellite in order to send emergency SOS signal messages. Now, this is a pre-scripted thing from what it seems like, meaning that you only have a couple things to select from in order to send messages. This is interesting, and they also mentioned that it's going to be available for free for the first 2 years, because if you're familiar with sat phones, you know that these have quite a cost to them, and they're also much bigger and bulkier, which is why they can do things like make phone calls over satellite versus this, which is just small hyper-compressed messaging. And something else they also tied in with this SOS feature is the ability to give satellite location to people in your Find My network. So the old rule when I was in Scouts was that if you're going on a hike, you tell somebody what time you're leaving and when you should be back. And essentially, they just got to wait and see if you come back. And then if they don't come back in the time you said, that's when they start to worry and go on a hunt for you. In this case, you can actually give updates as you go along. That's kind of cool. Overall, these two features kind of made it feel like Apple was really pushing safety. This included with the Apple Watch features, like the sort of breadcrumb dropping trail maker mode on the new Ultra Watch, which we'll talk about later in another video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. All of this stuff really seemed like Apple was catering their devices to adventurers. Now, I haven't gone on a hike in a very long time, and the most extreme hikes I've ever been on were in New Mexico, back when I went to Philmont, so that was well before any of this was necessary, so I'm probably not going to use it, but it's a nice thing to see. And again, it's going to be available to both of the new iPhone models, so whether you buy the standard or the Pro, you'll get those. Something else you're actually going to get with both devices doesn't have anything to do with survival and just has to do with taking good photos, which is the new Photonic Engine. Now, this is still something that I don't 100% understand. I'll have to see if there's a noticeable difference when I get my hands on one of the new iPhones, but it seems as though they're introducing the deep fusion method that they've used for a couple years now a little bit earlier in the pipeline for their photos. So that means that when you take a picture, it continues to do the pipeline work that it already did, and then just introduces the low light, high light, mid-exposure combination with uncompressed photos this time in order to give you a better overall image. This will be interesting to see in terms of how it performs, considering that on one iPhone we'll have the same or a very similar camera system to what we're already used to, and then we have a new one that is very different. Something else Apple introduced that's kind of neat is their new action mode with the camera. This kind of reminds me of the horizon stabilization that GoPros use, but from what I've seen, at least from early previews, it looks like the quality of the video is much lower. And that's unfortunate because the stabilization is pretty wild. You can actually see that it's almost gimbal-like, but my best guess is that they're going to be taking a 1080p video and just moving that space, that 1080p space of pixels, all over the sensor in order to stabilize it, as opposed to using integrated stabilization like what they use with sensor shift, which is going to be available on all the new iPhones as it was last year. Now, the last feature that's going to be on both of these iPhones is actually not so much a new feature, but it's an improvement to an existing feature, which is improvements to cinematic mode. And this one kind of pisses me off for a reason we'll talk about in a bit, but essentially what Apple did was they bumped up the cinematic mode that was available on the 13 Pro to 4K at 30 FPS, and a selectable 24 FPS. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with cinematic mode, this was basically portrait mode for video, and this was something that was introduced on the iPhone 13 Pro, and for my content, I could have probably found a few things to use it for and just sort of played around with it in my content creation in general, but everything I make on YouTube is in 4K, and for this one, it was 1080p at 30 FPS, and this is where I was kind of not finding use for it because, well, everything I shoot is in 4K. Now it's 4K at 30 FPS and a selectable 24 FPS, which in my use case is the frame rate I use. Yeah, MKBHD says 30 is the best. I disagree. But either way, they introduced this on the iPhone 13 Pro, and now they've improved it for the 14 and 14 Pro. And my problem with them introducing this improvement on the 14, not so much the 14 Pro, but just the 14, is that it's using the same processor as the 13 Pro, and yet we haven't had a new improved version added to the 13 Pro, because why would you? You got to go upgrade to the new one in order to get the better cinematic mode, which I'm also still probably never going to use. But it's just kind of frustrating to know that the exact same, or yeah, the exact same chip is capable of doing it, but isn't doing it on my phone. Bummer. But putting aside my frustrations about the fact that the A15 Bionic both can and can't do 4K cinematic mode with 24 FPS, the rest of these features are actually really cool. I'm super excited to actually try them out because the Photonic Engine for me seems most interesting since I do a lot of photography and video, and I'm hoping I'll never be in a situation where the satellite SOS is useful, but it's kind of cool to have. Car crash detection with the cars I have, I hope that's not the case, but with one of them in particular, I'm hoping that at least if it does happen, I have my phone with me, but cool stuff either way. But now with those out of the way, we're going to dive into each of the new iPhones and talk specifically about what changed between the 14 and the 14 Pro from last year's 13 and 13 Pro. And we're going to start with the 14s. So the 14 models now ditched the mini version of the iPhone. Rest in peace, you can still buy it, it's $100 less, and the starting price for the 14 is the same. So you can actually still get the iPhone 14 if you're just looking for a standard iPhone at the same price as the 13 for last year. That's kind of cool. And overall, I think that it's a pretty smart move on Apple's part, though if you do want to buy a 13, it's still available and it is also still less expensive. So you've got both options available to you. However, in lieu of removing the 13 mini, they've now added the 14 Plus, meaning that you have the larger 6.7-inch display of something like the 13 Pro, but you have it available at a lower price point, $100 more than the starting price of the iPhone 14. So if you're one of those people who would like to have a more day-to-day use phone, you don't need the extra cameras or the fancy displays, and you just want something reasonable, but you do like the larger screen, you can now get that with the standard models as opposed to having to jump up to the Pros. That's actually pretty cool. The iPhone 14's camera system seems to be more or less the same, however they did improve the front-facing camera to have autofocus, which I thought the 13s had autofocus on the front. I guess I was wrong, but they talked about how this will allow you to essentially be able to take selfies from further away. I don't know, maybe TikTok now will have better depth of field and focusing. It's neat, but kind of not something I would have anticipated being a priority for Apple, but they did it anyway. Apple also mentioned that the battery life on these new phones is the best in any iPhone. That's kind of cool, but you got to keep in mind that the statistic they're pulling from is audio playback, so things like video or web browsing or phone calls are going to be similar or the same. We also have a bunch of really interesting new colors. Now, this is sort of what would have drawn me to the 14 model if I wasn't always getting the Pro models for the cameras. I loved the Sierra Blue from last year, this color here, and this new blue that they introduced on the standard 14 is pretty close to that, so I really like it. But now, of course, we have the controversial bits, which is the no SIM tray. You have exclusively eSIMs, which here in the States shouldn't be a big deal, and in most other countries it hopefully won't be a big deal, but there are a few carriers in other countries that only use SIMs. You can't get an eSIM. That's going to be weird. Maybe Apple's introducing a model with a SIM tray internationally, but at least here in the States, if you got one of the main carriers, you'll be fine, but I'm sure there's some, I guess you can't get track phone for your iPhone if you want to have an eSIM, but they got rid of the eSIM, and they kept the A15 Bionic chip. Now, I'm not one of those clickbaity YouTubers. In fact, I really don't like those clickbaity YouTubers. I made an entire video going against the grain with everybody complaining about how the M2 chip overheats when you stress test it for 2 hours on the roof in the sun. I find it more fun to kind of try to be down to earth, and I'm going to do the same here with Apple, including the A15. I'm not going to defend it. I'm just going to say what I think. In my opinion, people complaining about Apple using last year's chip really doesn't hold water when you look at the fact that all Samsung had to do was make a phone that folded in half and barely lasted a year without breaking, and they put last year's chip in it, and nobody complained because it folded. I think because Apple didn't do anything revolutionary with the design and it pretty much feels like last year's phone in a lot of ways, yeah, people have more of a reason in their head to complain. But Apple did put the chip from the 13 Pro into this, meaning that you have the better GPU and 6 gigabytes of RAM compared to the original iPhone 13 A15 model, which had 4 gigs of RAM and 4 GPU cores. So you did actually get a minor improvement. Nothing crazy, and if anything, I think this is probably the chip shortage rearing its head for Apple. I think that for most people, if you're going to do day-to-day and you're just looking for something that is going to get you by for the next couple years, the A15 with the 4 gigabytes of RAM and 4 CPU, or GPU cores rather, would be just fine for most people, and the people who have those phones, the old 13s, are probably still going to hold on to them for quite a long time. And the fact that you're now getting the Pro chip in the non-Pro model, even if it's a year old, isn't going to matter to most people. And you also have to keep in mind, and Apple pointed this out a couple times, that the competition is still so far behind. So 1 year back on Apple's chips still means 2 years ahead for a lot of other Android competition from Snapdragon and Exynos. So that's just something that I think is going to remain the case for a while. Overall, I think that if you're coming from something like an iPhone 11, a 10s, or a 10, you're definitely getting a good purchase with the new iPhone 14 because it's just a good upgrade overall. You've got the features that matter, you've got the camera improvements, and at the end of the day, if you really don't think you can justify buying something like the iPhone 14, the 13's still around, and that thing is still great. And really, you're only losing out on a few camera features, the satellite features, the car crash detection, and you're losing a GPU core and 2 gigs of RAM. If you can justify that and you want to save some money, go for it. But now with the iPhone 14 out of the way, let's talk about the 14 Pro. And this is the one that actually had me the most excited, and just to let you know, I've already pre-ordered it, so hopefully I'll actually be fairly on it with the review cycle. I can actually get a video out in a reasonable time frame as opposed to waiting months like I have in the past. So again, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. So yeah, if that doesn't tell you that I'm excited about the iPhone, I'll just tell you right now, I'm pretty excited for the iPhone 14 Pro and I can't wait to review it. So what has me so excited? Well, a couple things. And I'll tell you right now, I am fully aware when I go to buy an iPhone that the features that are added to whatever the new iPhone is tend to be things that Android has had for a while. But I also know that generally once Apple puts it into a device, it's more than just a feature that's put in basically as a tech demo. They try to make sure that it's integrated in a way that it's actually useful on a regular basis. And from what I can tell, there are 3 different things that Apple added to the 14 Pro that are basically the perfect example of that. The first one is the new camera sensor. So yeah, while the Galaxy Note Ultra and a couple other devices have had 108 megapixel camera sensors whose software doesn't even know what to do with that many pixels and bins them anyway, Apple has finally introduced a 48 megapixel sensor after a decade of, in my opinion, some of the best-in-class mobile photography coming out of a 12 megapixel sensor. Now, for this new sensor, Apple is binning the pixels for their standard imaging, so you're still going to be getting a 12 megapixel image with the lighting equivalent of a 48 megapixel sensor. Essentially, they are combining their pixels into what they're calling quad pixels, and this is where you're essentially getting that 12 megapixel image with a lot more sharpness, a lot more light, courtesy of those extra pixels. However, if you shoot in ProRAW, which I do a lot, and I'm going to probably have to stop because it'll fill my phone up very quickly, you get the full 48 megapixel image. And with Apple's pipeline for photography and the new Photonic Engine, I'll be really curious to see how the detail, the lighting, everything about this new sensor will play out once you start taking pictures. Something they didn't introduce, even though they have the larger sensor, is 8K video recording, which I'm kind of glad about because I've used mobile phone 8K recording on some Samsung phones. The way the phone overheats and the compression that has to go into just getting that amount of pixels binned 30 times a second doesn't justify it. So I guess that's not quite something Apple's ready to introduce yet, but I will be curious to see how the 4K imaging comes out on this bigger sensor. That'll be something exciting. Another thing Apple introduced on the new iPhone 14 Pro that's been around for a pretty long time, even on their own watches, is an always-on display. I remember back in the day seeing so many Android phones with always-on displays, and when I worked at Best Buy, I remember seeing so many always-on displays that when you turned them on, there was burn-in on them. And that's because the way that a lot of Android phones, including Motorola, I remember that one being notorious for burning in, the way they would do the always-on display is just turn all the pixels off except for the ones that had some information on them, but the screen was still refreshing at 60 hertz, so it would be pretty detrimental to the battery, and you're also wearing those pixels out quite a bit. Apple has introduced always-on display, and in this case, while it is very late to the party, it is going through on a 1 hertz display, meaning that the screen only refreshes itself once a second. And the benefit to this is that it's way less work for the battery, way less work for the screen, and however they manage to do it, you can actually have an image and not just some text stuck on the screen. So that's going to be kind of cool to see. I'm really interested to try out some of my brighter wallpapers and see how Apple's always-on display will dim, because so far the always-on stuff we've seen from the Apple Watch has been preset wallpapers and preset watch faces. This is going to introduce a whole new challenge because there are so many varieties of wallpapers, from photos to wallpapers that you can download online to the pre-built ones on the iPhone. So I'll be curious to see how this always-on display holds up. But overall, yes, I know it's late to the party, but it's here, and I'm super glad it's here. I cannot wait to actually try it out. And the last thing that we've had to wait on, but now that Apple's introduced it, it's actually a pretty useful feature, is a hole punch cutout on the screen, or as Apple is naming it because they name everything, the dynamic island. Now, we've seen hole punch cutouts before on phones, and in a lot of cases, in fact most cases, the method of keeping them out of the way is just to shove them over into the far right corner alongside your notifications on Android phones, and it just lives there, and when you need it, it's like, hey, it's over here in the corner, and that's basically it. Apple didn't do that. They've actually put it in a way that it interacts with software. It's almost like a mini multitasking tool, which is kind of cool. So when you swipe music that's currently playing, it puts it up at the top. If you have your voice recorder or a phone call running, it'll put it up there. And if you have multiple things going, like a timer and a phone call, it'll put them next to one another. And it puts it around the Face ID and the camera. This is actually really cool. And something I've seen that I don't think a lot of people have talked about is the fact that there are pixels between the Face ID sensor and the camera. And the only thing I've seen those pixels used for so far is for the little indicator for when the microphone or the camera is in use. I saw that in a short, and it seemed like a pretty interesting use case. Because yeah, before this, we didn't really know how they were going to use this dual cutout, because we were just seeing a dual cutout with the pixels fully lit up in the middle. But this actually makes a lot more sense. So yeah, even though we've had higher resolution sensors for quite a while now with Android phones, Apple is finally putting their Photonic Engine or their image processing pipeline to better work with a higher resolution sensor, and hopefully we'll actually see the benefits of it. And yeah, even though we've already had always-on displays for quite a while now, they've been running at 60 hertz or maybe 10 on some screens, finally we don't have to worry, or at least it seems like we're not going to have to worry about as much battery burn or screen burn because it's going to be running at 1 hertz. And yes, we've had a hole punch cutout for years now, but Apple's making use of it with something that has a silly name and a genuinely useful set of features. Say what you will about it in the comments below. The last few things we have to talk about on the iPhone 14 Pro include the colors. We have the same silver and gold, but now we have a darker version of space gray, which they're calling space black, and deep purple. I got space black because I bought the Sierra blue and then for a long time just put a case on it and never saw it, so I'm not going to bother with the new colors. And of course, with the new iPhone, we have a new processor, the A16 Bionic, but this one was interesting because they compared it performance-wise to the A13, because the A13 was still beating out the closest competition from Android phones. So I don't think it's going to be a massive upgrade. In fact, from what I've seen, it looks like it's going to have the same amount of memory. However, we are on 4 nanometer, and we do have more processes per second that this can do. So there'll probably be, my best guess is maybe a 16% performance improvement, but overall, the CPU is probably not going to be the highlight of these new features on the iPhone 14 Pro. So yeah, the iPhone 14 and 14 Pro do, in terms of looks, seem pretty similar. It was nice to see that we didn't get any price hikes, but the number of features that we did get, in my opinion, were pretty cool. I'm more excited for the Pro features, like the better sensor, the always-on display, and the hole punch cutout, but overall, I think both options are pretty solid. And again, you have a whole lineup available just behind these from last year that are completely viable options. I don't think the 13 is any slower than it was last year. It's just a bit older now. So overall, I think that these devices should be a pretty solid upgrade for the year. I do wish there had been a little bit more on the 14 side, but it is what it is. Like I said, I'm going to be reviewing the 14 Pro in the next few, hopefully, weeks. It should be coming in at the end of the month, and I'm also moving at the end of the month, so there might be some weirdness there, but hopefully we'll have it in, we'll have a review in, and my review cycle timing won't be too far off. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss that. And of course, leave a comment down below letting me know what you all think. Make sure to keep an eye out because I will also be putting up a video soon about the new Apple Watches. That should be a bit of a shorter video because there's not as much to talk about, but watch it anyway, it'll be interesting. And aside from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.